Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you. My name is Luciano Cabral, and here I am again for another lecture on American literature. This time, I'm going to be talking about a very well-known short story by William Dean Howells called Editha, first published in 1905. As usual, I'm going to be counting on my book, The Norton Anthology of American Literature. And also, I'll be counting on a collection of essays by William Dean Howells himself, first published in 1891, called Criticism and Fiction. All right, that being said, no further ado, so let's go, let's talk about the short story, Editha. Let's go. All right, the lecture for today is Editha, a short story by William Dean Howells. And first of all, I would like you to take a look at that cover over there. When I was Googling to get a cover to use here on the slide, obviously I could find a lot of different covers, but this one called my name specifically because this one displays the war, and Editha revolves around a war, and the war is the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was a very short war. It lasted only 4 months, and the U.S. was victorious. But it's interesting because the whole short story is based on this war feeling, and we're going to be talking about that. So let's go. But before we talk about the short story itself, let's just discuss a little bit the background and William Dean Howells himself. If you have watched the previous videos, you're gonna remember that I mentioned William Dean Howells in the 2 previous videos. And why that? Because William Dean Howells, for the American literature, he is a very important name. So he was a novelist, a playwright, a critic, an essayist, a reviewer, a poet, an editor, and he was always in the public eye. And he was really influential, especially when it comes to a growing middle class readership in the 1880s and the 1890s. He was born in Martinsville, in Ohio, in 1837, and surprisingly enough, he had little formal education, but from a very early age, he helped his father, who was a publisher and also a printer. And that's what contributed to Howells's interest in criticism and in literature. At the height of his career, he was referred to as the Dean of American Literature, especially for his promotion of the new American realism. Howells has, in reality, a prolific literary career, especially his essays on writers and also on realism. And in his essays, many of them published in magazines and newspapers, such as that one, the New Monthly magazine. He attacked sentimentality of thought and feeling and the falsification of moral nature and ethical options wherever he found them in fiction. And let's not forget that he famously defined realism. And for him, he believed that realism was nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, especially the motives and actions of ordinary men and ordinary women. Um, Howells, Howells had been finding his way as a novelist during his 10 years as an editor. And as an editor, during his years as an editor, he published 7 novels. And his debut novel was Their Wedding Journey in 1872. And it's interestingly, these early novels are short. They're not complex novels at all. They're actually linear narratives that deliberately avoid the excessiveness and the exaggeration of characterizations. And also these novels avoid the plots of romantic fiction. And he does so in favor of a more ordinary realism. A little more than 10 years later, Howells published his most famous novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, in 1885. And this novel traces the moral rise and also the economic collapse of Silas Lapham. Silas Lapham. A typical American, Silas Lapham was a typical American entrepreneur who has built a paint manufacturing company out of a combination of sheer luck, hard work, and shady business dealings. During his lifelong career as a literary writer, as a literary authority, Howells used to look inward and also outward. What do I mean by that? Is that Howells, throughout his career, he promoted some contemporaries and looking outward, like Leo Tolstoy and Henrik Ibsen, Emily Zola, George Eliot, and also Thomas Hardy. But he also used to look inward in a sense that he also supported many younger American writers and early on recognized and publicized the work of talented African American and women writers. And those are, for example, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Charles Chestnut, Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, and we're going to be talking about her here in her short story, Edith Wharton, and Emily Dickinson. Howells was also a very active political supporter. He was a member of the Republican Party, and he wrote Abraham Lincoln's campaign biography. In 1898, he publicly stood up against the Spanish-American War, the war who serves as a background for the short story Editha. Those who sided with the war claimed that this war was an unselfish effort to liberate Cuba from Spain. But Howells suspiciously feared that this war was actually about the U.S. expansionist designs on Cuba and also on Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and other Spanish colonial territories. And now talking about Editha itself, in Editha, Howells explores the moral failure of individuals who've been corrupted, who gave in to American sentimental values. The Spanish-American War isn't, as I said, specifically mentioned in a short story, but the story revolves around it. And it brings to the fore the romantic conceptions, or the romantic misconceptions, if you will, of the glories of the battlefield, and also of the rush to war. And this tale suits properly the political moment. Although it was published, it was still the political moment the after war, because it was published in 1905. I mean, seven years, about 7 years later, 7 years after the end of the war. Okay, and let's talk about, let's jump now into the short story, Editha itself. I got here some questions to guide us, to walk us through the short story. Okay, so let's talk about them first. So when we always think, or when we always debate any kind of literary work, I would say, so the first question that comes to my mind is, what is the plot? Yeah, what's the whole thing all about? The plot is about a couple who has been dating for, has started dating for a short time, has been recently started dating kind of not so long ago. It's mentioned, not, directly mentioned, but it's mentioned here in the novel that her relationship, romantic relationship, has not been a long term, a very short term indeed. It's about these couple, Editha Balcom and George Gearson. And they have basically what is the plot is about is that they have, and we're going to see that throughout the short story, we're going to see that different standpoints on the same thing, and the same thing is war, or different standpoints on reality. And these couple, these two characters, they have different clashing standpoints on war. And so Editha, who is a girl, a young girl, she is very romantic, she's very idealistic, and she believes that George Gearson is the perfect man for her, but he is not yet totally perfect. And because of that, she thinks that he needs to go and fight in a war. But George Gearson has a lot of second thoughts. He is doubtful, he's suspicious, he sometimes thinks that the war, not only this war, but wars in general, are worthless, are pointless. And these stories about these clash of points of view on war. The second question to guide us through is, who are the characters? There are actually 5 characters in this short story. Editha, George, Miss Gearson, George's mother, Jonatas Balcom, Editha's father, and there is also a lady. In the end of the short story, she appears in a conversation with Editha. And this lady, she's an artist, and she's there sketching Editha. because she's a painter. But what I would like you to keep in mind is that although there are 5 characters, I would like you to pay attention to at least 3 of them. The 3 of them. Oh, and there is also, anyway, there is also Editha's mother. Yeah, she also, she has a voice here. She has some participation here in the novel. But anyway, I would like you to keep in mind at least 3 characters here that for me, they're very important. And they are Editha, obviously, yeah, George, the boyfriend, and Miss Gearson, also George's mother, because these 3 characters are the ones who are going to make the plot move, yeah. So we're gonna see something going on especially because of these 3 characters. Not only that, obviously, but also when we think, yeah, these 3 characters and we try to put them together, we see that there is a kind of tug of war, in a sense that there is Editha, yeah, and Editha on one end of the rope, there is Miss Gearson in the other end of the rope, and in between there is George. And the whole short story, we can say that it's about Editha pulling George so he can be convinced of the purpose or the right purpose of the war, that the war is worth fighting. And I mean, on the other end of the rope, there is Miss Gearson, George's mom, pulling the rope in order to make George understand that this war is really worthless. This war is pointless. There's nothing to fight for here when it comes to this war or any war. But obviously, they're going to do it differently, because most of the time we're going to see that Editha spends more time with George than Miss Gearson. But we can think, and that's interesting, when we think of the characters, we can think of this tug of war, this being and this rope being pulling from side to side. The other question to walk us through the short story is a question about the narrative voice. So which narrative voice is used here? And that's interesting, because when you think of the narrator, we notice that this narrator is an extra, what we call the extra diegetic narrator, in a sense that this narrator is not part of the story. The narrator tells us the story, but he is not a character in a story. He is he or she. But anyway, in my mind it's anyway. Okay, I'm gonna call, although it's gonna sound kind of weird, let's call this narrator an it. All right. Okay. Anyway, so this narrator, he is an extra diegetic narrator, and he is away. He's only an observer. He is away from the story. he narrates the whole thing, but he's away. And it's interesting because when we think of third person and it's a third person narrator, when we think of a third person narrator, we might think of a narrator and a kind of omniscient, a kind of all-knowing narrator. But actually, there is an element here, and this element is focalization. And that's interesting because although it's a third-person narrator, this narrator knows everything about Editha, and only about Editha. What I'm trying to say is that this narrator knows not only tells us not only Editha's words and actions, but also what comes on Editha's mind. And in a sense, he also tells us about Editha's thoughts and feelings. This narrator narrates George's actions, George's gestures, the other characters' actions and gestures, but he can only come inside Editha's mind. And it's interesting. I'm saying that in order to make sure of what I'm saying, take a look at the verbs used by this narrator. For example, when he tells us about George, the verbs are say, repeat, answer. Sometimes he says seem, in a sense that he tries to come closer to George, but he can only, this narrator can only speculate. So he uses, this narrator uses, I think I'm going to keep stumbling on that, saying he. But anyway, this narrator uses, because it can only speculate, so it uses the verb seem. So again, say, repeat, answer, seem. So now let's take a look at the verbs that this narrator uses to talk about Editha. And the verbs are also say, repeat, answer, return, but also and only. This narrator uses these words only for Editha. There is also believe, notice, understand, think. So this narrator knows what Editha thinks, what she believes, the things that she understands, and when she understands the things she does. So in this sense, we can say that this narrator focalizes Editha in a sense that everything, or most of the things, not everything anyway, but most of the things that this narrator sees, it sees it through Editha's perspective, through Editha's eyes. And this narrator is also is powerful enough to be inside Editha's mind. So this narrator knows what she thinks, what she believes, and how she notices things, and when she understands things, this narrator also knows and reports these things to us. All right. Let's keep talking about, now I'd like us to move more specifically to the short story. And let's go. Take a look. I'd like us to take a look at the first scene here. Because the first scene, although it's just an opening scene, the scene tells a lot about what's coming next, a lot about the way Editha behaves, and what we expect, we readers expect from her. Okay, so let me read you these, the opening paragraph. And I quote, "The war was thick with the war feeling, like the electricity of a storm which has not yet burst. Editha sat looking out into the hot spring afternoon, with her lips parted and panting, with the intensity of the question whether she could let him go. She had decided that she could not let him stay, when she saw him at the end of the still leafless avenue, making slowly up towards the house, with his head down and his figure relaxed. She ran impatiently out on the veranda to the edge of the steps and imperatively demanded greater haste of him with her will before she called aloud to him, 'George!' So this scene, as I said, is interesting because we can see Editha as a frisky character, as an impatient girl, when she sees that her boyfriend is coming over. But not only that, and the gestures as well, that's interesting because she is impatiently waiting for him. She is friskily and waiting for him, so she cannot hold herself still. But there is also something interesting, and it is in the very first line of the short story. It is the phrase "war feeling." So although, as I said, the Spanish-American War is not specifically mentioned here, we know that there is a war, war news, yeah, I mean, hovering in the air, and this war feeling means that everybody, the whole country is thinking about the war, the whole country is talking about the war, and the war is the most important news of the moment here. So the narrator talks about the war feeling, especially because the whole narrative, the whole short story is based on this war feeling. And when we keep reading the first paragraphs, we can see that from the very beginning, we can see that George and Editha have different viewpoints on the war, because when they meet, the first thing that she asks him, because she sees from his face that probably his face is not mentioned here, but probably his face is he's frowning, probably, and she asks, "So what is it?" And the first thing that he says, it's war. And again, the war is mentioned, not only the war feeling, but in George's mouth. The war is coming out of George's mouth here. So, and he is thinking about it. And he says, so he says, it's the war. And when he says it's the war, and we obviously we don't have at this point we don't have so much evidence, but so we can infer somehow that he is worried about, because it's the first thing that he mentions, especially because it brings the news that the U.S. Has declared a war against Spain, yeah, and a war that it was also only a feeling. Now it is something real, yeah. Now it becomes a reality. So the war feeling, it was only a feeling. Now this war comes true. And when he says that it's a war, and we know that he is, now we know that he is worried about that, she replies, Editha replies by saying, how glorious. So this is the moment that we just start, making up these, as I said, these different standpoints in our minds. It's interesting because it says, oh, it's war. And she immediately replies, so how glorious. So different standpoints on the war. And he repeats, so it's a war. And then he repeats, yeah. And she, because of this opening scene here, yeah, being shown, the narrator, let's not forget, as I said, the narrator is focalizes Editha. So this narrator knows what's coming on Editha's mind. So the narrator says that Editha thinks that George is a nearly perfect man, and that's interesting because it's there. But although that she says that he is nearly perfect, so the question is, what's then Editha's sense of perfection? Because she says, and I quote, all the while, in her duplex emotioning, she was aware that now at the very beginning, she must put a guard upon herself against urging him, against trying to convince him to fight the war, by any word or act, to take the part that her whole soul willed him to take for the completion of her ideal of him. And this is the first time that we come across the word ideal, ideal related to Editha. And we're gonna find these, not only there, but we're gonna find this word again. Ideal is gonna be the very last word of this short story. What's interesting here is that we find the word ideal here related to the way Editha idealizes George, and in the end of the short story, this word is the very last word of the short story. That's pretty interesting. Let's keep it in mind. All right, let's keep going. He was nearly perfect as he was, and he must be allowed to perfect himself. So what is interesting here is that Editha, as an idealist, I'm sorry, for her, it's not enough to have a nearly perfect man. She wishes to have a fully perfect, a real perfect, a complete man. I mean, a man who is not nearly perfect, but fully perfect. And that's interesting. And keep going. But he was peculiar, and he might very well be reasoned out of his peculiarity. Before her reasoning went her emotioning. And this is the very moment that we realize that Editha is a romantic woman, a romantic in the sense that she idealizes the world. She doesn't take the world as it is. She doesn't take the world as the truthful treatment of a material. So she somehow fakes the world around her. So she idealizes war, she idealizes George, and idealizing everything, she wishes to have a perfect man. So again, before her reasoning went her emotioning, her nature pulling upon his nature, her womanhood upon his manhood. Without her knowing the means she was using to the end she was willing. She had always supposed that the man who won her would have done something to win her. She did not know what, but something. It's interesting that for her, a perfect man must do something to win her, although she has no idea what this something is. But it's interesting because, again, we don't have something concrete. It's also, again, an idealization. It's something. But what is that, Anne? She doesn't know what that is. She has no idea what that is, as the narrator says, but she did not know what, but something. And it seems that she sees in war this something, because the narrator keeps going by saying that George Gearson had simply asked her for her love on the way home from a concert, and she gave her love to him without, as it were, thinking. So there was love being offered by George, and the only thing that she does is she takes it. She takes love without thinking about it. And again, so it corroborates the idea of before her reasoning went her emotioning, because she doesn't think, she didn't think about her relationship. She only said yes when George asked her out. But now, and that's interesting, because although the narrator says that she did not know what this something was, when we keep on reading this passage, this segment here, so we understand, we try to, we make it this something less blurred. Especially this part here. and I quote, George Gearson had simply again, let me read it again, asked her for her love on the way home from a concert. And she gave her love to him without, as it were, thinking. But now it flashed upon her if he could do something worthy to have won her, be a hero, her hero. It would be even better than if he had done it before asking her. It would be grander. So a perfect man for her, for Editha would be a man that could become a hero. Yeah, and in her mind, becoming a hero is fighting a war. So this was her chance to have a hero for herself by turning George into a hero, and that's the reason why she keeps trying. She keeps trying to persuade him to fight the war, to enlist and fight the war. But let's go back a little bit in this paragraph, because the narrator mentions the phrase duplex emotion, and that's interesting for us, this duplex emotion, and because although she seems Editha seems to have made up her mind to convince George into fighting the war. She's caught. She's caught in this duplex emotion, and what is that? This duplex emotion is Editha's wavering between the female passive role and the male active role. Because in her mind, especially this passage here, her womanhood upon his manhood, for her, that's not something that a perfect man would do or would let her do. Because this duplex emotioning is the fact that she wants to play this female passive role, but she knows that she also needs to man up a little in order to convince George. But in her mind, if he was fully perfect, she wouldn't need to convince him to do anything, or not even to fight the war, because he would be a hero, and he would be a patriot, and he would fight this war even without her talking about it over and over. So this duplex emotioning is Editha being the female, playing the passive role, being a woman, expecting her man to be a hero, to fight the war and win the war, and becoming a soldier, a famous soldier, and coming back from the war to her, and probably taking her in his arms and kissing her, and then she has his hero. This would be her role as a passive, her passive female role. But she knows that she also has this, she also needs to be, I'm sorry, she cannot be so passive, because if she keeps being passive, she will not convince him to fight the war. And not convincing him to fight the war means that Editha will never have her hero. So this is this duplex emotion, and I repeat, Editha's wavering between her female passive role and her male active role. Yeah? Being a woman and waiting, waiting passively at home for her hero to come from the war, and being actively and very hard trying to convince him to fight the war. It's interesting. It's pretty interesting, this idea of a duplex emotioning that we're gonna, and then you come across this duplex emotioning throughout the short story till the moment, not throughout, I mean from all along, but until the moment he decides to fight the war. Okay, let's keep going. And as I said, when I summarized the short story talking about the plot, the whole short story presents these clashing standpoints on the war, especially, not only, but especially between George Gearson and Editha Balcom. And we can see these clashing standpoints. When we think of this clashing standpoints, as I said, one of the ways to think about them is paying attention to the stage directions. And the stage directions are sections in which the writer tells us readers, about the characters' actions without telling us about thoughts and or feelings, the characters' thoughts and feelings. So take a look at these stage directions. These stage directions are in pink, as you can see that. So George Gearson, for example, I suppose so. And he says, and the stage direction is, he returned languidly. This is the moment they are talking about the war. They are discussing the war, and they have different opinions about it. And then when he thinks of the war, he thinks of the war languidly. So the adverb used is the adverb showing that George is not excited. It's not, he's not, there is no enthusiasm when it comes to George. On the other hand, when we take a look at the stage directions used to show us Editha's behavior, so it's different. For George is languidly, but for Editha is fervidly. And she says, oh yes, right or wrong, she returned fervidly. So languidly for him, fervidly for her. And the narrator keeps going, keeps providing us these stage directions. Another one is, she entreated him. Don't you think so? She entreated him. She is very forceful, and this is the moment she almost begs. Don't you think so? She's almost begging him to understand her point, to understand that the war is something really worth fighting. And another one is that George says, the narrator says, he went on as if to himself without apparently heeding her. He's not paying attention to her. That's the moment he's thinking about. He's trying to come to terms with the war, but he's still thinking about the war, and he's not paying attention to her because he is thinking about the war. On the other hand, she tries to convince him, and she tries to do so very carefully, so very romantically. And the narrator says she seized his hand in her two hands and poured her soul from her eyes into his. This is a very romantic segment here, so a very romantic word. So pouring her soul from her eyes into his eyes. So in this sense here, we can understand her strategy, because Editha is trying to make him understand. So she's trying to move her standpoint on to George, to make him understand the way she does, the patriotic way that she understands war. And that's interesting. So stage directions are very important elements in order to show us this clashing standpoints on war. But not only that, we can also think of three elements showing us these clash between idealism and realism. And these three elements are religion, patriotism, and the American flag itself. There, it's interesting. So, and let's talk about these three elements. Let's start with the religion. Idealism is personified obviously by Editha, and realism is here in this moment of the short story personified by George Gearson. And when it comes to religion, patriotism, and the American flag, there are different viewpoints on these three elements. So let's talk about them. For example, there's a moment that Editha says that the war is the order of providence, and I quote, "But don't you see, dearest," she said, "that it wouldn't have come to this if it hadn't been in the order of providence? For her, God has to do with this war. For her, this war was sent by God himself, herself, itself. It was sent by God." Because of that, she approaches, and that's interesting because she approaches war and religion, or war and God, saying that God is the one who wants the war. God is the one who actually declares this war. But as a reply about religion, George is going to say something else. Not only that, she says the order of providence, and she also says that God meant it to be war. And I quote, because she said very throatily again, God meant it to be war. And the conversation goes on. You think it was God? Well, I suppose that is what people will say. Do you suppose it would have been war if God hadn't meant it? And that is George's reply, and a more realistic reply than Editha's. I don't know. Sometimes it seems as if God had put this word into men's keeping to work it as they pleased. And then she replies by saying, "Now, George, that's blasphemy." It's interesting because she idealistically says that war was meant by God. But George comes and say, "Oh, I am not so sure. I am I'm having doubts, always suspicious that God has anything to do with that." It's interesting because he believes that God has nothing to do with that. It's human beings. War is human beings' issues, not God's issues. The second element is patriotism. And again, we can see this clash between idealism and realism. And let me read you this segment related to patriotism. And I quote, "And I call any war glorious that is for the liberation of people who have been struggling for years against the cruelest oppression. Don't you think so too?" And this is the moment that she thinks that this war is a humanitarian journey, is an unselfish U.S. Journey. It's almost a kind of self-sacrificing war. And again, when we think of what I said about Howells, for example, being an antebellum activist. So he would think that it's nothing it's not about an unselfish enterprise, but rather an expansionist design. And to reply to this segment, George will say something different related to patriotism. And he's going to say here, for example, is still talking about patriotism, and I quote, "Oh, I know that, Editha. I know how sincere you are and how I wish I had your undoubting spirit." And again, so this is the reason why in Editha's mind, George is not a perfect man, but nearly perfect, because he's doubtful. He's not, for her, he's not courageous enough. Anyway, let's keep going. I'll think it over. I would like to believe as you do, but I don't now. I don't indeed. It isn't this war alone, though they seem peculiarly wanton and needless. And again, he thinks it's pointless. He thinks it's worthless. And he says here it's needless. Wanton, it's a whim. But it's every war so stupid, it makes me sick. Why shouldn't this thing have been settled reasonably? So for him, patriotism has no place here, because or even war, Why war? Is war really the last resource? Is the war really the final word? Why fighting a war? And that's interesting because she is all patriotic, but he is still suspicious. And the last one, I would like to talk about this idealism, this realism, this clash of viewpoints on war, has to do with the American flag. So let's talk about it a little bit. Uh, uh, Editha, there is a moment that Editha writes a letter trying to convince George that fighting a war is the right thing to do, because fighting a war is God's will. Fighting a war is patriotism, and fighting a war is also because they were all American, and that's the reason why they must side with their country. Yeah. I mean, no matter, it doesn't matter if the country is right or wrong. Yeah. But even if the country is right or wrong, it's written here. It's interesting because it's written here that, look at that, because there's a moment that say, oh, right or wrong. So then our country in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country right or wrong. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if the country is right. It doesn't matter if whether the country is right or wrong. So the country is going to be right anyway. This is not reasonable. Yeah? This is all about emotion, and this is all about Editha, because she is the one before her reasoning went to her emotion. That's what the narrator says about her. And she writes George a letter in order to convince him to fight the war. And after she writes a letter, she ties the letter, and the way she does has to do with the American flag. And I quote, "She had it ready to send with the packet she had tied with red, white, and blue ribbon." So it's interesting because for her, the American flag is in itself convincing. So the only thing that she needs to do is to tie her letter around white, red, and blue ribbon. And so it's all done. And this is the most convincing way to do it. But in response to that, George is going to say something else related to the American flag. This is the moment, and here this segment I'm going to quote. This is the moment that he is drunk, and he enlists to fight the war. He's convinced by Editha. So he says, okay, okay, I have enlisted and I'm gonna fight this war. So and this is the moment here that we know that he has lowered the walls that were protecting him from being convinced. So now he's the captain, and we know that he's going to fight the war. And this is the context behind this thing, these words here by George Gearson. What a gorgeous flower you were, with your red hair and your blue eyes that look black now, and your face with the color painted out by the white moonshine. So again, we have the three colors of the American flag, white, red, and blue. And she goes on, and this is the most interesting part. Let me hold you under my chin to see whether I love blood, you tiger lily. What is interesting here is that he looks at her and he sees on her face the American flag, but this American flag is smeared all over by blood, and he wants to know, by looking at her face, he wants to know whether he loves blood, because he knows what's coming next when it comes to wars. So he knows that he's gonna fight, he knows that he's gonna see bloodshed. He knows that he may die, and he does in a short story. He in reality he dies, and he grabs her chin, and that's interesting. He grabs her chin, and he sees on her face. He wants to know by looking at her face that if he loves blood. So in this case here, different from Editha, who thinks that the three colors of the American flag are colors to convince him, to patriotically convince him to fight the war. So George here also uses the three colors of the American flag, but he sees blood, he sees violence, he sees battlefield, and he sees death. It's interesting. These are these clash of idealism and realism in these three elements: religion, patriotism, and the American flag. Now we are about to discuss the last parts of this short story, and this is the moment that after George's death, this is the moment that Editha and her father visit George's mother, Miss Gearson. And this conversation is again a struggle between, it's a whole quarrel between the symbol of idealism and the symbol or the personification of idealism, Editha, and the personification in this moment, Miss Gearson. It's equally interesting, I would say equally worth noticing that the one who, in a short story, who materialized realism, the realistic view on war, which was George, now is replaced, after his death, is replaced by Miss Gearson. So there is always in a short story, all over the short story, this clash between idealism or romanticism, if you will, romantic values, and realistic values. That's interesting because when we think that these realistic values are gonna die together with George, who represented the realistic values. These realistic values are replaced by another character, and the character now is Miss Gearson. Keep it in mind. It's important also. So also interesting here to keep in mind is the description of Miss Gearson's house. Her house is described here. It's described here as a dark place, gloomy, creepy, and just because now a house which was probably we can only speculate because it's not in a discourse here, it's not in a narrative. Anyway, a house that could have been a happy house is now a mournful house with a mournful mother inside. And I quote in the description of this dark and sad house. It was very low inside the house and so dim, with the closed blinds that they could scarcely see one another. Editha, tall and black in her crepes, which filled the air with the smell of their dyes. Her father standing decorously apart with his hat on his forehead, as at funerals. A woman rested in a deep armchair, and the woman who had let the strangers in stood behind the chair. And this is the place where this whole conversation is taking place here, and these gloomy, this creepy, this dark location is now the place where realistic values are, and they are personified by Miss Gearson's. Now, as I said, she replaces her son. And it's interesting because of the war, because of the outcome of the war, and here more specifically, the outcome is George Gearson's death. Now, the place in which realistic values or realism is dark, gloomy, creepy place, a mournful place. And it's also important to bear in mind. But anyway, what's also important bear in mind is the last part of the conversation between Miss Gearson and Editha, because Miss Gearson in this moment here tries to make Editha understand that life, the romantic values cannot be held on to, because when we hold on to romantic values, the consequences are death in this case here. And then she says, and I quote, "No, you didn't expect him to get killed. You thought it would be all right for my George, your George, to kill the sons of those miserable mothers and the husbands of those girls that you would never see the faces of." The woman lifted her powerful voice in a psalm-like note. "I thank my God he didn't live to do it. I thank my God they killed him first, and that he ain't living with their blood on his hand. What you got the black on for? take it off before I tear it from your back. And she's referring to Editha's black dress, because she is to show Miss Gearson that she's also mournful. But Miss Gearson angrily complains, saying that she has no right, Editha has no right to be mournful. She has no right to be sad, because she was the one who had sent George to the war and consequently to death. And here I just want to finish this video by talking about the closing scene, because the closing scene is interesting, because again, as I said, the last word, remember that we talked about the word ideal, and here the very last word of the short story is ideal again. So we had ideal in the beginning, and the characters struggled with these clash between idealism and realism, and now again the word ideal comes back. And this is the moment that this closing scene is kind of isolated scene right after that conversation between Miss Gearson and Editha. The conversation ends, I would say, all of a sudden, but we can understand there's nothing else to say about it, so that's over, that's it. And there is now another scene in another place, another location, probably, obviously, not probably, but obviously sometime later. Yeah, and this is a conversation between a young artist. It's called here only a lady, and this lady, this artist is sketching Editha. Editha is probably sitting here posing for a portrait, and this lady, this artist, is drawing or painting Editha. And we also learn that Editha has been telling the same story the narrator is telling us. Editha has been telling this story, has been telling this lady this story. And this girl, this lady, seems to be as romantic as Editha is. And I quote what the lady says, this artist says: "To think of your having such a tragedy in your life," the lady said. She added, "I suppose there are people who feel that way about war. But when you consider that the good this war has done, how much it has done for the country, I can't understand such people for my part. And when you had come all the way out there to console her, got up out of a sick bed, well..." So it's interesting that in this point here, the sadness or the loss here is the other way around. It's not Miss Gearson's loss anymore, or a mother being mournful for her dead son, but in this case here is a girlfriend who had convinced his boyfriend into war, and he died because of that. Yeah, and these lady says that the tragedy is not Miss Gearson's, but the tragedy is actually Editha's. And it's interesting that these character, this lady, sums up the whole behavior. I mean, she says that Miss Gearson's behavior is vulgar, and this is the word that puts, brings Editha back on romantic tracks, because the mystery, because Editha was, probably it's said here, Editha was blaming herself for George's death, but after hearing the word vulgar, so it seems that the mystery is now over. The mystery is now solved. And the narrator says, the mystery that had bewildered her, Editha, that had bewildered her, was solved by the word vulgar. And from that moment, she rose from groveling in shame and self-pity and began to live again in the ideal. And it's interesting here because the ideal is to understand or to grasp this whole moment as her, as Editha being actually victimized, not being blamed for George's death, but actually being the victim of a vulgar mother, a mother that had no right to treat Editha the way she did. And this is again the way that Editha starts again to live, as the narrator says, to live again in the ideal. All right, so it seems that she hasn't learned her lesson, unfortunately. But anyway, that's it for now. Okay. So thank you very much. This lecture here, we could talk about Editha, as I said, a very well-known short story by William Dean Howells. And Editha summarizes, I would say, Howells's definition of realism, nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material. And Editha is the very opposite of this truthful treatment of material, in a sense that she's the character who lives again and again in the ideal. She is the personification of idealization. She is the personification of the romantic values, the fake values that should be despised, should be left behind and replaced by reality, by realism, by a true, by the truth, by a truthful treatment of the world, of reality. and of the war, because in this sense here, war was not glorious at all. War means violence and war means death. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you very much for being here with me in this lecture, and see you next time for some more. Thank you very much. So, bye-bye.